Governor Brian Kemp, a Republican, on Thursday, filing a lawsuit against the Atlanta City Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms, a Democrat, regarding the face mask mandate. How is this going to impact the potential spread of the coronavirus in the state of Georgia?
It's going to exacerbate that spread. We know that Georgia already is among the 18 states facing the hardest resurgence. We know that more than 130,000 Georgians have contracted the disease as of today. 3,000 have died. We know there's a disproportionate effect on communities of color. And we know that this mask mandate, or the refusal to allow one, will simply go against both CDC guidelines and the unpublished unpublished recommendations of the White House, which says that mandating masks make us safer and help stop the disease from spreading.
All right, and now let's get to something that you are very much working on, and that is the issue of access to voting in the November 3rd election. How can we assure Americans that mail-in votes will be counted on November 3rd?
First, we have to guarantee that they have the right to vote by mail. We have 34 states that allow vote by mail with no excuses, meaning anyone can do it, but we have 16 states that put restrictions on it. And unfortunately, we have a president who's doing his level best to undermine the integrity of the process. He, in a very erratic way, said that he doesn't believe in mail-in balloting, but he believes in absentee ballots, which are the exact same thing. He has spread this lie about voter fraud being exacerbated by mail-in balloting, which is wholly untrue. The states that have used this have been able to demonstrate time and again this is not a problem. But we also have inaction by the U.S. Senate until they approve the HEROES Act, which will give $3.6 billion to cash-strapped states to allow them to expand vote by mail and scale it up to what we know is going to be necessary in the midst of COVID-19, as proven by primary usage. Then we will not be able to guarantee that people get that right to vote, let alone that those votes can be counted.
Leader Abrams, when I interview Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill, it feels like that act that you alluded to is going to be falling upon partisan lines. So what does the government need to do in spite of that in order to make sure that the ballots are counted? And what institutional structural changes need to be made immediately, really, ahead of November 3rd?
Well, the structural requirements are three. One, we have to have expanded access to mail-in ballots. Number two, we have to have expanded access to early voting in the states that do not permit it. And number three, we have to have preservation of in-person voting on Election Day without a reduction in polling places. The HEROES Act will accomplish all three of those things by giving the states the resources they need. And the reality, this isn't a partisan issue. We have Republican secretaries of state like Michael Adams in Kentucky, who has said that vote by mail is the safest way to vote. We've got Democrats who've been calling out the same. And we know that states across this country are being forced to slash their budgets because of the COVID pandemic. And that the reason we have a United States of America, the reason we have a federal system, is that it's the responsibility of the federal government to step in moments of crisis like a pandemic and support the states in executing the constitutionally required November election. These are things that can be done, but we have to put aside partisanship to make sure it happens.
Should every American get a mail-in ballot in the mail without having to request one?
Every American who is eligible to vote should receive a ballot that is postage paid. That is absolutely the right thing to do. That would be the gold standard. But I live in reality. And so what I'm asking for is that we remove as many of the barriers as possible, that we put guardrails in place to ensure that everyone who wants to vote by mail can do so. However, we have to remember that not everyone can or should vote by mail. If you are disabled, if you have a language barrier, if you have if you are homeless, if you've been displaced by COVID, there are a number of communities that simply don't have the right or the capacity to vote by mail, and they need to be able to go in person. And that's why we can't simply focus on vote by mail. We have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, do vote by mail, in-person early voting, and Election Day voting without a closure of precincts.
I hear you on this, Leader Abrams, but I got to press you here because we're just, a couple of months away from the election. And, I'm curious whether or not the bureaucracy in the federal government, at the U.S. Postal Service, for example, whether or not they are actually prepared to handle the influx number of ballots that could be coming their way. How do we guarantee that the institutions that are really going to be on the front lines of counting the votes for democracy are adequately prepared for the potential of a massive increase in mail-in votes?
We start now. We make certain that our Congress acts now. The House has taken action. If the Senate passes the HEROES Act, it includes the guardrails we need, includes the resources we need to make certain that the U.S. Postal Service isn't weaponized by Donald Trump to block access to the right to vote. It ensures that states and local governments have the resources they need to scale up absentee balloting. It ensures that we have the poll workers we need to do this process. But we also have to tell people it's going to take longer than 11 p.m. on election night to know the answer. When in the midst of crisis, we have to adapt. And that adaptation is not only possible, it is necessary. We also know that every single state in the country has the capacity and the infrastructure for mail-in voting. This is about scale, not about capacity. And if we get the resources to scale this up, as Vice President Biden has called for, as Republicans and Democrats have called for, if we do what Tom Ridge, a Republican, has called for, and what good Democrats and Republicans are calling for across the country, we can make this work. But we have to have a president who actually believes in our democracy and leans away from his cowardice and his ignorance and actually works for Americans for once.
You said something right there about the expectation of not necessarily getting the vote on 11 p.m. on election night. How might this change the way that Americans get their election results, practically speaking?
Well, practically speaking, we have to pay attention to the fact that in Wisconsin, in Georgia, in New York, it's going to take a minute. But if we have done the work on the front end, if we have stopped this partisan undermining of the process, if we have recognized the legitimacy of voter suppression and done our work to push it aside, if we have invested in the infrastructure we need, then people will have the patience. We know that South Korea held their single largest election in April in the midst of COVID-19. So there is no excuse for us not being able to do this work. What has to happen is that our will has to meet our obligations. And that is that we have to have the resources from the federal government, the commitment of state leaders, including secretaries of state that unfortunately have practiced voter suppression in the past. But together we can make this happen. And we have to have the patience of the American people to know that once they've cast their ballots, if we've done our part, we will get an answer.
Leader Abrams, in your book, Our Time Is Now, you write about how you are the daughter of two civil rights activists. And actually, your father was arrested at the age of 14 for helping to register African Americans to vote in Mississippi. Here we are in 2020, where the nation has been having for a national discourse around race relations in this country. Do you think that the momentum of this moment might be able to yield some results as it relates to upending voter suppression?
I do believe so, but this is going to be a process. There's not a moment where we have not had voter suppression in our country. And so my mission right now is progress. How do we mitigate voter suppression so that more and more of the people who deserve to be heard are able to make their voices heard at the ballot box? How do we make certain that we understand that voter fraud is a lie, that it is rare and it is almost I don't believe it's ever really affected an election, which is different than election fraud, but that voter suppression is real and that its intent is to defeat us, to convince us it's not worth trying. But that if we understand that it exists, if we fight back against it, then we have the ability to shape the future, especially dismantling structural racism for the first time in our country. It's going to take time. It's going to be more than just a single vote, but this vote in 2020 is an important start.
Leader Abrams, as you have campaigned on this issue as well as for progressives across this country, you are often seen as a potential vice presidential pick for presumptive Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden. How has that conversation impacted your advocacy work, and what type of vice presidential pick do you hope the Biden team selects?
I've been doing this work since I was a college student. I've been working on voting rights because my parents raised me to understand that the power of a citizen begins with the power to vote. And that is why in the wake of the 2018 election, I founded Fair Fight. It's why I'm also focused on the 2020 census, which is just as important in setting the future of our right to vote because it determines our political districts. And that's why I created Fair Count. I have been working on this and I will continue to do this work because I'm driven by the mission of making sure that we have the policies that right our country and that make us all eligible for opportunity. And I look forward to watching Vice President Biden select the person he wants as his running mate. There's no one who knows better what he needs because he's done this job. And I believe that no matter who he picks, I'm going to be shoulder to shoulder with them, making certain that Vice President Biden becomes the president of the United States and that we start to right our democracy and restore America.